It's my pleasure now to introduce Scot Spencer. He's from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where he is the Associate Director for Advocacy and Influence. Now, one thing that I learned about Scot this afternoon was, and he was getting the Understanding the Challenge, a poverty simulation experience exercise underway. That is going to be repeated again on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. And I'm here to proselytize on behalf of Scot to encourage those of you who weren't able to make it this afternoon to give that a shot on Saturday morning. So having been quite shameless in promoting that session, let me ask Scot Spencer if he could come up here and introduce his panel, which is going to be Making Development Work for All, From Promise to Practice. A big welcome for Scot Spencer.
We are going to have the opportunity to talk, think, meet, deliberate, and learn from one another about the great work that is happening around the country to make communities more livable, walkable, and equitable. How to do transit-oriented development that's better for everyone. We will discuss the role of policy and practice considerations that promote equitable development. Hopefully, you'll engage in conversations that lift up how smart growth development happens with communities and less to communities. You'll be able to learn from the place and share those learnings by social media, and I would encourage folks who Twitter or tweet to use the hashtag NPSG to catalog your thoughts, impressions, and ideas as you go forward. Right now, since we've got a pretty good crowd, I'd like to kick off this session with a little bit of audience participation. And you shouldn't have to worry because I'm not going to ask you to involve, talking to someone else you don't know just yet. But I just want a show of hands on 3 questions. First of all, how many of you have been forced out of your home, be it by a breakup, eviction, or the result of urban renewal or some other redevelopment? It's a small number. That's really sort of the historic, notion of displacement involving dislodging from the place that you're accustomed to. How many of you have witnessed a change in your own neighborhood such that you don't feel welcome there anymore? A few people. To me, that's a sort of a different form of displacement. It's sort of the loss of the sense of place, the sense of community, that you don't feel welcome there anymore. And it's very different than feeling like, the gentrification is, making you have to leave, but you just don't feel welcome there anymore. Lastly, how many of you, I know your hand's going to go up, don't feel that you can move from your current place of residence because the housing cost has changed so much that you couldn't afford to live in your current neighborhood, or that the move would create a community that would impact your quality of life? There you go. That's the sense of gentrification. So, we're gathered here as policymakers, advocates, neighborhood residents, elected officials, funders, just about every stripe imaginable for the next couple of days to learn from one another and hopefully go back home with at least one new tool, strategy, idea, connection, or partner who will ensure that the smart growth is inclusive growth. That begins with the understanding of the potential unintended consequences of actions taken under the banner to create more livable, walkable communities. That we engage in dialogues with sufficient honesty to understand the complications on the many sides of the equations we face of time sensitivity and political urgency, of historic institutional divides and growing institutional bridge building, of the real dynamics of race and class, of a sense of place and its loss, of children, of youth, of adults, of seniors, of business people, of houses of worship, fields to play, and streets to stroll. With that, I want to introduce my panel, and I'm very glad to have these folks on the panel, and going from my immediate left all the way across the way. Bill Cole, he was twice elected as member of the Baltimore City Council, representing downtown Baltimore and my neighborhood for a time being, before being appointed in August 2014 by Mayor Rawlings Blake to head the city's quasi-governmental development agency, the Baltimore Development Corporation. He's a former member of the House of Delegates and a former special assistant to U.S. Congressman Elijah Cummings. Bill also served as Associate Vice President for Institutional Advancement of the University of Baltimore, one of our anchor institutions, for nearly 12 years. And he also co-chairs, with someone I know pretty well, the Opportunity Collaborative, the consortium charged with developing a regional plan for sustainable development in the Baltimore region. Next to him is Thibault Manekin. Thibault is the co-founder of Seawall Development Corporation, and prior to starting with Seawall, Thibault launched a nonprofit organization, Peacemakers International, which uses basketball to bring together children on different sides of racial and religious conflicts. And I'd like to mention that also the White House recently recognized Thibault as a champion of change. Next to him is David Bowers, who is Vice President and Mid-Atlantic Market Leader for Enterprise Community Partners. His work includes facilitating affordable housing and community development deals in collaboration with government agencies, leaders, not-for-profit, and nonprofit developers in Baltimore and Washington. His office provides capacity building and technical assistance to local nonprofit leaders. Next to him is Andre Leroux. Andre is Executive Director of the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance, so he was able to make it through the snow to get here. Andre has led efforts to reform zoning laws, increase transportation investment, and support vibrant communities. He's worked with the state legislature, Harvard University, and a community development corporation in his past. And last but not least, and I'm happy to say this one because I happened to meet Dawn at this same conference last year.
It's our anniversary, Scott.
It is. We were in Denver when a lot of people couldn't make it to Denver because of the snow on the East Coast. But Dawn Phillips is the co-director of programs at Causa Justa, or Just Cause. Bay Area membership organization, that's the San Francisco Bay Area membership organization, focused on housing and immigrant justice issues. CJJC builds grassroots power and community leadership through rights-based services, policy campaigns, civic engagement, and direct action and movement building, where Dawn also leads the local, regional, and national policy campaign work for that organization. So, while I've already probably done it, I'm going to actually do a quick opening question, and they were asked to do this in sort of a 20-story elevator sort of scenario, but I'm asking each of them just to start out by giving you an elevator speech of what their organization does, if you don't get it. So,
Baltimore Development Corporation is the city's quasi-governmental economic development arm. We are funded primarily through the city of Baltimore. 80% of our funding comes from the city. The rest of it comes from other sources. We're an economic development agency. That's the easiest way of describing it.
We're a Seawall development company. We focus on the adaptive reuse of old abandoned historic factories, warehouses, and building. Our idea is to use the real estate and built environment to make neighborhoods better places. I think one of the pieces that differentiates us is that our focus is on filling those finished products with the people who are doing the most important work in our cities. For us, that's teachers, anybody focused on the kids, and nonprofit organizations that are out there strengthening the success of the Baltimore City public school systems and now public school systems around the country. We feel that we can use the built environment to help make a difference in education, and it's been an incredible opportunity seeing a crazy but talented and passionate group of young entrepreneurs moving into neighborhoods that have been forgotten, acting as their own anchor institutions, taking those neighborhoods over after they felt comfortable living in apartments for a year or two, fixing up houses, buying vacant homes, working with the mayor's Vacancy to Values program, taking back other warehouses, starting companies, starting restaurants, starting bakeries, and the tipping point that a small group of passionate entrepreneurs can have on a city if you give them the tools to succeed.
Hello again, David Bowers. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Baltimore. I want to thank the organizers of the conference for having me here and Scott for allowing me to be on the panel. I like to describe Enterprise as a real estate finance and solutions company that's in the people business, and I always say that is not a cliche. Our generational goal is to end housing insecurity, which we define as folks who are living with severe housing cost burden, paying more than 50% of their income for their housing expenses, homeless folks, or people who are living disconnected from key resources like good transit, good education, good health care, good job options. Our goal by 2020 is to impact 1 million of those families to try to reduce housing insecurity. Our platform and approach is really in 3 buckets: through financing, through systems change, and through policy work. Historically, we've provided over $16 billion of financing, impacting about 320,000 households through our financing work, and have done a lot of work in the policy and systems change work. We were founded by the late Jim and Patty Rouse, who were really icons here in the state of Maryland and left a strong legacy.
Thank you. Andre Leroux from the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance. Just like every individual needs a support network of family and friends, so does every community group and individual group of residents that are trying to transform themselves. And the Smart Growth Alliance created a program called Great Neighborhoods to try to create that support network. But because not every community does the right thing, and because there are also regional needs that need to be taken into account, it's important that we have the right laws and rules and regulations and financing in place to make sure that there is equity across the region for everybody. And that's why we also do policy work at the state level.
Great. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Right on. Okay, so thank you, Scott, for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be here. So Causa Justa organizes Black and Latino communities in the Bay Area around racial and economic justice issues with a focus on housing, immigrant rights, and community development. I think that most of our day-to-day work will be fairly recognizable and familiar to a lot of you in the room, but there are 3 aspects of our strategy that I want to lift up. Firstly, our work of building the leadership and power of low-income communities of color. In our view, it's only when historically disenfranchised communities are informed, fired up, and organized that they're able to assert their interests and their needs. And we don't think that a vision of equitable development or any other kind of vision of equality and justice can be achieved otherwise. The second aspect is that our work is committed to being both extremely place-based and focused, as well as being scaled. So the goal is to effectively address the kind of immediate day-to-day concerns that we're seeing in our neighborhoods: evictions, habitability issues, overcrowding, etc., while developing the capacity to actually take on the regional, state, national, and international aspects of these problems. Lastly, our work is not just about building up neighborhoods, it's about building movements. No single organization can affect the kind of deep transformation that's really needed in our communities, which is why we have to build partnerships, build alliances, and work across silos from the local to the international.
Great. So, for those of us who advocate for smart growth, the fact that cities are hot again is a good thing, right? I mean, we used to say that Baltimore, in certain parts of neighborhoods, they were neighborhoods of last resort, but now they're becoming neighborhoods of choice. Storefronts are becoming occupied, streets are again becoming populated with people, and people are living in downtown buildings. In Baltimore, for example, we've branded the 401. It's a census tract as a place to live. Last month I was in L.A., and in downtown L.A. the population, there is a downtown L.A., but the population has actually grown from about 6,000 people to 75,000 people over the past 5 or 6 years. Some people think that's a good thing, but I'd really like to turn to the panel and have you offer your own perspective on what the upside and the downside of this resurgence is in these urban places. Starting with Dawn?
Sure. So I want to take this opportunity to firstly say 2 important things. One, the work I do, and me personally and my organization, we're not against development. We are for it. We think it's needed. It's very necessary. Oakland, where I live and work for almost 30 years, has gone from the murder capital to, USA Weekly's top 5 this week, top 3 next week. We're up there. It's what Scott's saying. So what's the good and bad about this quote-unquote urban resurgence? So the first thing I would say that's good and positive about it is that things need to change in historically disinvested communities. These neighborhoods are not working. They haven't worked for a long time. And nobody knows that better than the people who are living there and have lived there a long time. So change is necessary and change is needed. The second thing that's good is that some version of what people have been asking for a long time is happening, right? So better roads, better streets, better lighting, some version of transit improvements, etc. But the way I think about it is I had a conversation pretty recently with one of the older residents that we organize in East Oakland. I don't know if folks know places, but you'll ask me if you need more explanation. But so she's lived her whole life in East Oakland, and she was talking to me and complaining about bike lanes that were coming to her neighborhood, right? And I said to her, aren't the bike lanes good? And she said to me, my son has been biking in Oakland and East Oakland for 40 over years. He's like 44 or something. And she said, we never had bike lanes before. It's the beginning of the end. Yeah. No, she was quite serious. Yeah. And she said, the bike lanes are the first step of getting us out of our neighborhood, right? So for a lot of the people that I work with, there is a deep concern and a deep anxiety about the changes and about what's happening. So what's the downside then? What are some of the concerns? One, for the most part, there isn't a sense of a perception that what's coming and what's developing, the warehouses, the folks coming in to start bakeries and businesses, the yoga studios and the coffee shops are not for the folks who've lived there a long time, right? So long-time residents, vulnerable residents, this is not really change that is for them, right? Secondly, we hear all the time from the planners that we work with in the city that their priority, their vision for the work that they're doing is to meet the needs of new residents over and over, and they're quite clear when they talk to us about that. And so, rightly so, then existing residents have some level of anxiety and apprehension about what's happening. Thirdly, most of the development is privately driven. By and large, our sense is that our city governments, our planning staff, are not aggressively really thinking about how this change and how the changes are going to actually serve people. And then the last thing I would say is, most of our cities are actually majority tenants. So while this vision of ownership is actually important and critical, is a component of what we want to see long term, the reality is that we need strong anti-displacement policies in place in order to support communities to sort of withstand and buffer as new capital and capital investment comes in, so that doesn't end up being the kind of gentrification that Scot's talking about. And one more thing, Scott, the last thing for real. And we can't do housing security by production side strategies alone, which means that we need to really think about what are the policies that expand tenant rights, expand tenant services. How do we strengthen and improve the existing housing that people are living in that is relatively affordable to their families? And how do we do that soon and immediately?
Anybody else?
So I would just, as they say in my church, would just say amen. So all of that, agreed. The one thing I would add was, and Scott alluded to this, one of the downsides also is the loss of the sense of cultural identity and connection that can happen. And I think that's a real challenge in neighborhoods. And one of the things I've said to people is that it's funny to me. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and in the region, you kind of have Maryland, D.C., and Virginia there. And what's always funny to me is that you can walk into some environments, and white folks are scared of black folks coming. You can walk to other environments, and black folks are scared of white folks who are coming. And you go to some environments, and the black folks are scared of the Latinos who are coming. And you go to someplace else, and the Latinos are scared of the Asians who are coming. all within one metropolitan area. And what I've said to folks is I don't think a lot of people would care if the man from Mars came to their neighborhood if they believe they still have an opportunity to stay in that neighborhood and keep their culture and keep their cultural connections. But if Thibault comes in, and I feel like Thibault coming in means me, my house of worship, my music, my restaurants, all of that is going to be displaced. Now all of a sudden Thibault is the enemy. And I don't care who, fill in the blank on what Thibault's ethnicity or income background is. So I think that's definitely one of the downsides. And then when there's the lack of intentionality about planning for the market investments, that tends to happen. And of course, in America, you find that income typically is a proxy for ethnicity and vice versa. So oftentimes it becomes kind of this ethnic kind of clash and tension and income tensions and all. And that just exacerbates a lot of long-time fear. So it can tear at the heart and fabric of neighborhoods, of communities, of cities when it's not done intentionally and done well.
And I think part of that, the issue is really about having power and voice. And we don't have good mechanisms at the local level for, ensuring that people who live in those places get to sit at the table when development decisions are made. And I think that's a lot of what we're struggling with.
So I'm feeling like a little bit like the lone developer, but I don't know why you throw me under the bus either. There's a great mentor right here.
I'll back you up.
And from our standpoint, you heard a little bit about our previous background. I'm not a developer. I don't necessarily pretend to be a developer. We're learning as we go. We stumbled into this business of trying to roll out the red carpet for people doing great work in our cities, teachers and nonprofits, and it happened to be in a building that we were that had been vacant for about 30 years. And the first thing we did was go to I think the day before we bought the building, we went to the neighborhood association and said, tell us about the building, tell us about yourselves, tell us about the history of the place. And they had 2 or 3 other developers from D.C. who came in and tried to do 90 high-end condos and cram apartments down with no parking. And two of those developers ended up in jail, and the other guy ran out of money because he got tired of fighting the neighborhood. And so what we did is we worked with the neighborhood for them to think through what they wanted to see in the building. We never thought that you could put a coffee shop on the corner of Howard and 26th Street because more cars were stolen on 26th Street than on any other street in the city of Baltimore at that point. So who would ever walk there and who would ever go to the coffee shop? And the neighborhood said, we have no place to get a cheap cup of coffee, a warm tea, or even a muffin. Just please, put a sign up. Somebody will come in and figure something out there. And so we built the building together. The teachers who ended up living in the building designed every square inch of their apartments. They chose their own rents. The nonprofits did the same thing on their side. And at the end of the day, what you had is a significant $20-some million investment in this forgotten neighborhood that everybody who participated had the same sense of pride and ownership in the finished product. This co-op of 12 people showed up to take over the coffee shop, and President Obama was there 2 weeks ago. And so everything that's happened in this neighborhood of Remington has been driven by the community. We didn't know how to build a building. We certainly didn't know how to rehab houses. But the people that had been living, the teachers who had been living in this building said they want to be able to afford a place to live, and they see us as being able to provide the tools to do that. So we turned to the city and financing partners and said, how do we make this an easier one-step process for folks to come in and be able to realize their dream of being able to get in at an affordable rate and then get into neighborhoods. But it's high fives across the neighborhood when you're going there. It's the most intergenerational place I've ever been in my life. I mean, people who have grown up there for 70 years hug you when you're walking down the street because they feel like they're active in then we call it the redevelopment, of Remington. So, for us, it's just listening. The neighborhood came up with this plan to take 4 abandoned city blocks and turn it into something that looked better than vacant industrial space. And we listened to them about what it looked like, and we went out, and with the Enterprise's help, we were able to acquire it. And we came back to them and said, all right, now that you own it, what does it look like? And we spent the last 2 years programming it and figuring out how to have it be someplace that everybody's proud of. So Don't throw me under the boat,
Never that, brother. Never that.
It's a great partnership, and there's great opportunity if you just listen to have everybody's dreams come true.
In Baltimore, Thibault is known as one of the really good guys when it comes to neighborhood inclusion and making certain the communities around the table. And I've lived through this wearing my recovering elected official hat, and Councilman Kraft, who I did see here, one of my other former colleagues on the city council, has lived through it as well. In some of the waterfront communities here in Baltimore, where we've seen gentrification that has no racial implications, it's really socioeconomic and a transition between blue-collar neighborhoods to something different. It may be advanced manufacturing in some cases. In one specific case, I represented a neighborhood that a small little apparel company moved in and started to grow in a neighborhood called Locust Point. And Locust Point was an industrial neighborhood surrounded by water, rail tracks run. You have to cross rail to get in and out. So that tells you what type of neighborhood it is. It's on the port. And that little apparel company named Under Armour, many of you have heard of it, started as a few people and now has several thousand employees in the region. Many of them are right there in Locust Point. And when you put that much change all at once in a single neighborhood that was blue-collar and was defined by port jobs, Domino Sugar, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, and all of those companies leave with the exception of Domino Sugar. Domino still has 640 very good jobs right in that neighborhood. It creates a lot of internal stress on the neighbors. And while there's really not a difference in the number of people working down there, the types of jobs that are there are very different. So a Starbucks popped up, and you would have thought that, the world was ending because a Starbucks popped up in the middle of the neighborhood. And then the next thing that happened was Under Armour donated a $2 million AstroTurf field to the community. I've never sat through more meetings in my life over the fight over whether or not the neighborhood needed a brand new $2 million field. But when you have those types of situations, it gets very difficult because people feel like they're being removed from the heritage that is their community. They feel like the community is being taken away from them. And yet, most fascinating meeting I ever attended, a mother, she was a grandmother, probably early 70s. Her son and grandkid were arguing with her in the meeting over whether or not they needed that field. They wanted it, she didn't. She saw that as the final straw. Those are the types of things that happen all over the place, and you have to be very careful in how you're planning that type of transition in a neighborhood so people feel like they don't have to pack up and leave right away, much like you were saying. And it's very challenging because the jobs are changing in some of our neighborhoods, and you have to recognize that.
And Scott, I think I want to pick up on something that Dawn said earlier about the need for government staff and others to engage in a more intentional and aggressive, quite honestly, way with developers. Thibault and Don Manekin and Seawall Development, as Bill said, they are good guys. They're good folks, good hearts. I remember walking down one of the streets with Thibault about a year ago on one of the multiple tours we've done, and my colleagues and I were laughing like Thibault. We called Thibault the mayor of that street. Hey, Miss So-and-so, hey, Miss Jones, Thibault. It was wonderful, right? It was wonderful. Most developers, most for-profit developers, that's not how they roll. They're about maximizing profit. And what always gets me is how, because most developers aren't like Thibault and Don, for-profit developers, what they'll do is when someone raises issues like equity, like let's make sure people can stay. Oh my gosh, you're putting all these costs and regulations. You're going to put us out of business. We're going to leave. And I've always said to the mayors of my town, tell them they can go.
That's right.
Go make your money somewhere else. You want to go make your money? Fine. Because I bet you somebody else will come. Now, we happen, whether you're in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Oakland, or whatever, that is human nature. I'm going to say uncle and see how far I can go. Sometimes you have to say to somebody, and we had the chairman of Enterprises Board, who's a very wealthy man, conservative Republican guy, said to a bunch of for-profit developers in Tysons Corner, Virginia, a couple of years ago, look, maybe you need to take a slightly smaller return in order to make sure that we can have these kinds of communities that are inclusive. I say, in other words, it's like instead of getting a Bentley, you get a really nice Benz. Of course you want the really nice Bentley, but you know what? You'll be able to live with the really nice Benz. And if we want to have the kind of communities we're talking about, folks like a Seawall show that it can be done. So I think we have to engage more aggressively when folks who will, that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to say, I have to maximize returns. They're supposed to say, I don't want all this. But you know what? At some point, we have to say, no, okay, well, there's a give and take here. And if you don't want to do it, move on. The next person will.
So Dawn, this is starting to sound like an amen corner over here. But I want to see whether you, in your experience and some of the other things that you've seen, whether this is, point in fact of what's going on in lots of communities.
I mean, a couple of things. So I agree with a lot of what's been said, and we're having a collegial conversation here. I think David's right. I think, Scott, when you started this part of the discussion, you framed it as this kind of like time of urban resurgency, and the cities are coming back into fashion. The mayor talked about that. We're all clear. I agree with David. I think it's a false. It's a habit, or it's a perception from the previous period that a lot of the planners that we talk to haven't shifted their thinking. You can say to a developer now, if you don't want to do this project the way we're asking you to, you should go and we'll find someone else. And it's real now. 5 years ago, even there would have been a legitimate concern that if you can't pick and choose your projects in Oakland, right? Because we're so starved for any kind of investment, any kind of capital, any kind of interest on anybody's part. But this is a different moment. So I really agree. I think we have to ask for more. We can't do that like, I'm going to be the last girl at the dance and nobody's going to ask me to dance anymore. Our city, this is what the resurgence is about. It's like, I think we have more options now. I think we need to go. And then, Thibault, with all respect, I don't know very much about the neighborhoods you're talking about because I don't know the city very well. But it hurts me to hear you describe it as a forgotten neighborhood. I'm assuming it wasn't forgotten by the people who had lived there the whole time, throughout the disinvestment, throughout the dark years. So I get what you're saying, and what you're describing is really powerful. But that's the kind of thinking that is really, I think, alienating to the folks that I organize, to some of us when we hear our neighborhoods described as forgotten, when there are 15,000 people who lived there the whole time. I mean, the neighborhoods around West Oakland, where the docks were, where the railroads were, when all those jobs went away, people stayed. So I think we do have to think a little more, and I think this whole thing about how we do it, who drives it, and I appreciate. I think that's a beautiful story. I want to hear all projects go the way you said, but I have to honestly say it stuck out to me a lot to hear you call it a forgotten neighborhood. It's only forgotten. Capital forgot to invest in it for 50 years, but that's not the same as there were no people and that it wasn't somebody's neighborhood. So.
And I hear that point, but and I sort of want to sort of build on who was forgotten and what else is forgotten in the notion of sort of doing equitable development in neighborhoods. Part of a lot of this conversation has been basically about building buildings. And we all know that if we're trying to really do neighborhoods that are inclusive of all people, just making more buildings and then not having people who can get into them because they don't have access to employment opportunities or things like that is not necessarily what equitable development is about. And David, I mean, Enterprise has sort of been in the game for a long time. You started out really as a major housing corporation, but you've sort of, Enterprise has changed its game in lots of ways. So as we start talking about sort of more holistic approaches to equitable or development, what else do we need to be thinking about? And what else has Enterprise, gotten in its toolkit that, to offer to folks and so that people can actually think about housing plus.
Yep. I appreciate you asking that question, and that's why when I describe Enterprise and say we're in the people business and it's not a cliche, it's part of, for me, how to describe when you focus on the person and not the building. When we talk about, use language like preventing displacement and not just preserving a unit, really puts the focus on the people. So for us at Enterprise, it's been making sure that, yes, we can preserve the affordability of units, also making sure we can focus on the preventing the displacement of folks who are there. How do we get new units built? But that notion of the connectedness to opportunities, so the housing insecurity is not just if I'm paying too much in my rent, But if I can't find, the neighborhood that's been built up in Remington by Seawall is a great example to have, as Thibault described. If I can't get to some good food options, healthy food options, if I can't get to a good school option, good health care options, those kind of things, then I'm disconnected. And so we've been working more intentionally about, from a policy standpoint, programmatic standpoint, also from a financing standpoint, how can we engage with partners like Seawall and others who are intentional about trying to build that community in partnership and in collaboration? So it's engaging policymakers to think about that, and engaging developers, service providers. When we talk about supply and demand side issues, ending housing insecurity, we've started to think and engage more with folks who are looking not just at the unit side, but the people who are there. One of our most exciting things right now is working with the D.C. Housing Authority. They're trying to change the life outcomes for the 5,000 children who live in public housing. Normally, you wouldn't think of that as something enterprise would be engaged with, but we are, because if we don't change their life trajectory, 10, 15, 20 years from now, they're putting pressure on the affordable housing needs in the nation's capital, because if that intergenerational just keeps going on and on of needing subsidized low-income housing. And so we're starting to get more engaged programmatically and policy-wise, in addition to financing-wise, on that kind of work.
So Thibault, I'm going to defend you for a minute, and because part of this notion of what might be a forgotten neighborhood, on one end of the spectrum, you have neighborhoods that are in such high need that everybody wants to pay attention to them because they're such in dire shape, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have neighborhoods that everyone wants to be in. Our waterfront is people are climbing all over themselves to get to the waterfront. And the neighborhood that Thibault's working in is sort of one of those neighborhoods where it's not too bad off and it's not the highly desirable place. So everybody thinks that it should be able to take care of itself. And I would put that as sort of the notion of what's forgotten about it. So in order to do that, in order to sort of enter that place, you had to sort of create some pretty creative partnerships to make that happen. And so could you share with us a little bit about sort of what you did to go about and sort of building the financial partners and the resources to then sort of create the investment in the neighborhood that actually made the neighborhood kick again?
Yeah, and Don, thank you so much. It might not have been the right use of words. I talked a little bit about it. First of all, we came in not really being developers, which I think helped. And we were really honest. Like, we had no idea what we were doing. We had never done urban infill development. We had never done a brownfield redevelopment. We had never done historic adaptive reuse. We had never creatively financed everything, but we never really designed anything. But we knew really smart people who knew those things. So the first call that we made was to Enterprise, because they knew about the new market tax credits. And they were friends with the folks at SunTrust and U.S. Bank who knew about historic tax credits. And they gave us this enormous lesson around how to, creatively finance these projects so that while you're making a significant investment into them, your debt's low enough that you can, keep your rents low and affordable to the, workforce that, that's been the target population of the type of work that we've done. So I think that those partnerships are key, and being able to know what you don't know, I think, and has been kind of key to the success of what's been happening in Remington. And coupled with the fact that, the product that we've eventually built hasn't been necessarily thought through or designed by us. This concept of doing teacher housing, we had no idea what teachers needed in their housing. And so we had 10 teachers who worked for a year and a half in design. I talked about this, every square inch of the building. They told us that they didn't have access to photocopy machines at their schools. So they would run out to Kinko's in the middle of the night to plan their lessons. So we put a little Kinko's, a little mini resource center in the space. And at midnight, it's buzzing with people swapping lessons plans and sharing ideas. And so then they picked the rents. And so the partnerships were so vast to get this kind of a catalytic project off the ground in a neighborhood that nobody really wanted to, in a part of town that nobody really wanted to invest in. I think that was the key to the success of it.
Well, I think the partnerships point is very important because, nowadays in our network era, I think things don't get done the same way that they used to. No one sector, be it the public sector or the private sector or the nonprofit sector, can solve the challenges that we're facing, either at a global level or on a neighborhood level. And if you look at, the private sector has sources of revenue, the public sector has sources of revenue, but civil society does not have its own sources of revenue. And so they're often, the weak partner at the table, whereas they're the ones who are contributing a lot of the sweat. They're living it. And I think one model that we've started to look at in Massachusetts is what we call a community benefit district. And other places, it's been called community improvement district, or more people are familiar with the business improvement district model. But we need to go beyond the business improvement district model. It's an old model. It's based on that time when commerce was afraid of people leaving the cities and wanted to bring people back in, certain people back in, and wanted them to come and shop at the main streets that were dying. And so they were very concerned about, safe and clean types of concerns. We need a model for local governance that is appropriate to our era. And I think that what that means is that every sector has to have a part to play. So not only do the commercial property owners have to participate in paying into it, but also the nonprofit property owners and the public property owners, which in some of these older industrial cities in Massachusetts, that's the largest property owners. But in return, they also have to be part of the governance structure, and it has to be built in so that residents and key public and nonprofit partners are also represented at the table. And I think once there's a sustainable financial mechanism for doing that, then you can have real power and voice. You can go toe-to-toe with a developer. You don't have to feel like you're giving away the store all the time. You can have a role in the site design review process and things like that. I think it's got a lot of potential.
You said the magic word, governance structure, and I was looking at Bill because here in Baltimore there's actually been an effort around really trying to transform the governance structure about regional planning and regional development, and I just offer Bill the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Opportunity Collaborative and what it's striving to achieve here.
Sure. Scott had mentioned earlier that he knew the co-chair of the Opportunity Collaborative with me quite well. It's because it's Scot. So he and I have worked together on that for the last, he's been at it for 2 years, and I've been at it for the last year. To quickly follow up on your benefits district, Baltimore has 2 that are residential-based benefits districts. I served on one for 11 years. It is community-driven, 4 different neighborhoods of disparate incomes, and development levels came together and created a benefits district. It has done very well. There's a second one up near Johns Hopkins University. So we've actually experienced that model. It does work very well when you have community buy-in. As far as the Opportunity Collaborative, it is the regional plan for sustainable development. We got the second largest HUD planning grant in the country a couple of years ago now, and it's being managed by the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. And it truly is a regional gathering of government officials, nonprofits, advocate groups, and we are trying to create a regional housing plan, a regional transportation plan for Baltimore. And I will tell you that I can throw out some statistics that they prepared for me. Unfortunately, the mayor took all of my talking points, so I just have the statistics left. We were a city of 1 million people, Baltimore was, and we're now a city of somewhere around 625 to 630,000 people. So when you talk about the forgotten neighborhoods, there were 400,000 people that left the city, shrinking our tax base, creating the $750 million deficit that the mayor talked about, structural deficit. But when you look at our population, we have 24% of the region's population right here in Baltimore. We have 63% of the region's subsidized housing here in Baltimore. That includes the publicly and privately owned subsidized housing. We have 83% of the region's public housing right here in Baltimore. So you start to play it out and you understand that at the end of it all, you're going to get to a poverty conversation, and that is that Baltimore region as a whole has the 12th lowest poverty rate among the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas. In Baltimore City, our poverty rate is nearly 25%. In that region that I just described, it has the 4th lowest at 7.4%. So you create this huge disparity in the city and the surrounding jurisdictions. And we've suffered both financially and in every other way when you have such a high poverty rate and you have fewer people to pay. And so one of the things we've really been focusing on this plan is a regional plan for housing, affordable housing, for a transportation plan that connects people to jobs. Because one of the things we don't have here in Baltimore that you have in Northern Virginia or in D.C. is a metro system that connects people to those job hubs. We don't have that here. So we have a new Amazon fulfillment center opening that's got 1,000 new jobs. And Scott and I know the map very well. I think 80% of the city's population is more than 90 minutes each way in public transportation to get to those jobs. And that's 3 hours a day they're going to spend on a bus. So we have to do better as a region. It's not a Baltimore City issue. It's a regional issue. And once we start embracing it as a regional issue, we'll have a much greater impact on this. We can't absorb all of the low-income housing right here in the city. It has to be spread around, and yet we have jurisdictions around us that have taken very aggressive stances against affordable housing. And yet it seems like the dumping ground, when I say the dumping ground, the lawsuits tend to fly towards us, and they tend to miss the surrounding jurisdictions. And that's very frustrating for me because we end up defending ourselves for the fact that we have the highest poverty rate in the region, and yet the surrounding jurisdictions aren't doing as much as we are to address the issues.
Yeah.
Sorry for the rant.
So, in Baltimore, there's this effort to, in lots of ways, the Opportunity Collaborative is about putting together some of the essential building blocks to really, transform the region. In Boston, they're a different type of market city. They may be a great transit system. There's some tripping over themselves of successes. But there is this looming, if we're trying to build the basics, Boston has said to go for the gusto and go for an Olympics, right?
Well, we did such a good job with the big dig. We figured we'd go international.
So the big projects, everybody goes for them, whether it's a Staples Center in L.A. and, mega projects, the bigger the better. What's that got to do with equitable development, and what's the challenge to equitable development if around such a venture like going after an Olympics?
Right. Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but I'll just dig in. Obviously, in a city like Boston or the metro area like Boston, we are blessed with a good transit system, but it's one that's very old now. It's the oldest in the country, and so it's been estimated we need about $1 billion of capital investment a year for the next 20 years to really bring it to a state of good repair. So that's on the one hand, the transportation supply. On the other hand, our transit system is getting maxed out because of the pressure that's put on it. The housing market is so hot in places that have good transit access that we're starting to get to capacity at some of our station areas. And plus, we're a hub and spoke system. We don't have very good radial connections. So, one lens for looking at this is some research done by a friend of mine, Stephanie Pollack, who is a researcher, or was a researcher, at the Dukakis Center at Northeastern University, and I recommend that you go onto their website and check out the very practical reports that have been done there, where she's developed a model around equitable TOD. And Stephanie, it's very exciting for all of us and somewhat surprising, but Stephanie just became our new Secretary of Transportation of the state of Massachusetts, appointed by the new Republican governor. So very exciting and hopeful development. But this model around equitable TOD really, some of the research that's a little distressing that Stephanie did was she looked at some case studies of new transit lines around the country and what happened to those markets afterwards. And what she found is that the housing market heated up, brought in higher income folks to those areas, and those people brought cars with them. So transit use went down in those neighborhoods. And what we have to be careful about is how do we do good transit work? We can't not do transit investment or do rail expansion because only rail can support the densities that we need to produce the amount of housing that we need in our hot markets. But it means we have to do it differently. And it also means we have to provide better bus service because the transit riders that are dependent are oftentimes using the bus. So I think it's, there's a lot of challenges for us in the Boston area to try to grapple with these things. We have 351 cities and towns, 101 just in the metro Boston area. All of them it's home rule state, so all of them are basically their own fiefdoms in terms of controlling their property taxes and the kinds of zoning and development that they want. So that's why we really need to work at the state level to try to incentivize housing production and get more people into the communities that are being exclusive but might have good job opportunities and education opportunities. We have to, at the same time, provide better transportation opportunities for folks who are in neighborhoods where those opportunities aren't so great. And we have to make those neighborhoods, figure out how to do some equitable investment in those neighborhoods so that we're creating more jobs and better education in those places.
So as we sort of race toward the end, I got a couple of sort of broad questions. One is, the first one I would ask is, David, you sort of alluded to it, if you go into one neighborhood, one party may, not like the other party, be feared of the other party, and in order to do all this work, that we need to build a bigger table. And so what advice would you offer to the folks out here on how to build a better table?
So,
and that's for anybody also.
Sure. A couple of things I would say. One, there's got to be honest conversation, first and foremost. I think a lot of people come to the table and aren't willing to just say honestly, I like you, I don't like you, I like those people, don't like those people. We want more of this, not more of that. Our former superintendent in the district said something that was very appalling to a lot of people, but was very honest when she said, we got to bring in more middle and upper income families and students to the public school system in the nation's capital, or else it's going to continue to fail. Which, again, by proximate, we need to bring in more upper income white families. A lot of folks were offended, but at least she was honest. We had a council member in a county not far from here who recently said he had no sympathy for folks who needed affordable housing. Now, that's appalling to a lot of us, but at least now we can have honest conversation. A lot of people don't want to say, when we put that, there's a debate about streetcars going on hot and heavy down in the D.C. metro area. A lot of folks didn't want to say it. One of my colleagues said to me once, he was early 30s, white, grad school kid from North Carolina. He said, yeah, where they're going to put that streetcar line, I know there's a bus that runs down there frequently, but me and my friends, we're not going to ride that bus. Now, you put a streetcar in, well, I said, thank you. At least now we can have honest conversations. So that's number one. Number two, there needs to be an intentionality about, okay, once we have the honest conversation, who are we trying to provide for? What are we trying to provide? Now we can start to have an intentional conversation that says, hey, you know what? If we put that investment of that transit there, we had a council member in one of the most liberal counties in the country, Montgomery County, Maryland, about 5 years ago said, when someone said, if you build this purple line, make that investment, that's going to drive market investment around there, and people could get displaced. And the council member said, wow, I never thought of that. Wow. So it's an aha moment. So there needs to be an intentionality about if we do this, then this will happen. And then that goes to the third thing. Then we have to have specific conversations about what are the specific tools that we can use. Is it zoning policies? Is it acquisition funds? Private money, public money? What are the things that we need to do specifically to get to the desired ends that we intentionally plan for via compacts or whatever it may be, to make sure that the people who we all can agree in honest conversation that we want to benefit can benefit. I'll use one last example very quickly. There's a project, Columbia Heights Metro Station. Anybody who's in Washington, D.C., a lot of investments going on around that metro station. And we had a deal that came before us from a longtime institutional partner that they were going to preserve 66 units of housing in this place. I grew up in the city. That neighborhood 25 years ago was along the strip that was burned out after Dr. King was assassinated. A lot of investment went around that metro station. Prices shot up and everything. When the deal came for review, the city officials and people internally at our shop said, well, those prices are too high for affordable housing. And I said, well, what the hell do we expect? We got what we wanted. The amenities came, market pressures came, and now things are more expensive there. So in order to help those people stay, it means we're going to have to dip deeper into our housing reduction trust fund in terms of subsidy. Otherwise, those people go. It was an aha moment for me because then we were really to have honest conversation. If this is successful, this is what's going to happen. And if we want these kinds of people to stay, that means we as society are going to have to pay more from somewhere. And we, from the private investment standpoint, now we have to change our underwriting guidelines, the things that we're willing to take. That seems very high on a per unit basis. Well, it's going to have to be if we really want to make sure that people who can benefit from this transit investment and all the development that has come with it can benefit from it. So though honest conversation and intentionality about the planning, and then moving to specific tools that can be used to make sure we can get the desired ends.
David, I really appreciate that. I had written some notes, and they were in different language, but had a lot of the same perspective that you're putting out. Earlier, Thibault talked a lot about the complexity of a truly community-driven planning process. I think we have to get comfortable with complexity. And we have to start to think about these processes, these planning processes, as processes that were developed by humans. So then, therefore, humans can change them. 5 days to comment, 3 public meetings only, submit written comments in 4 hours. It's like we can change these things, right? So if we had stuck to a assigned technical process, what you achieved would never have been possible, right? It just wouldn't have fit in the box of how we operate and how we work. So how do we embrace complexity? How do we make planning about people and about values and about vision and about intentions rather than seeing it as a technical process, looking at it as a consensus building, a community building, an actual organizing problem rather than a technical problem, right? The other thing that I would add to what David said is we really have to go beyond this concept of community input to actually community decision making. There's been just too much and too many times where the neighborhoods and the folks that we organize with come and tell us, we literally don't want to go to another meeting to have another conversation about what we want to see. I say all the time, I started working in East Oakland in 1993 or something, and my first job was to go and knock on doors. And the same exercise, they sent me out to ask what people want. And now I talk to the same people. I still talk to them, and people said, remember in 1993 I told you we needed a grocery store, and today we still need a grocery store, right? So people are don't want to talk about what we need anymore. So how do we actually get from input to decision making when people express concerns about projects, when people raise questions about the nature of the projects? The planners and developers sit in the room and they nod. They're very polite. Some of them are very polite, and then they go ahead and do whatever they want. So how can we actually give people who are going to be impacted by these projects, by the processes that are happening in their neighborhoods, how can we actually give them a real say in the way that Thibault you talked about, and actually put them in the driver's seat? And then I think the last thing, and I think this has been talked about, we have a very narrow notion of who stakeholders are. Andre talked about it. A few folks already addressed this question. We have to fundamentally say it's not enough that the homeowners and the business owners are at the table, right? We got to get the public housing residents in. We got to get the tenants in. We got to get the renters in. We got to get young people in. We got to get the seniors in. So we gotta get beyond this notion that if you don't have money to put in the game, that you don't have any skin in the game. People who have lived 30, 40 years in their neighborhood care about what's going to happen, and we gotta get behind this idea that everybody's a stakeholder, and we need to treat them as such, and we need to ensure they're at the table. So,
excellent. You've started doing this, but I'm going to ask as we wrap up a bit of advice that you would give to one of your counterparts, either sitting here at the dais or out in the audience, about how to do better collaboration. toward more equitable development?
So I was listening to those comments, and I was trying to play back in my mind the meetings I've had with developers over the last 6 months. And there's two things that come to mind in listening. One is that most developers want certainty. They don't mind going through a process. They just need certainty in the process. They need to know there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we can't keep changing the end part, because that's when they lose their investors or they frankly lose interest. So as long as there's certainty in the process, I can support the concept of creating a different process, as long as there's certainty in it so that the person investing in that. And then I think we also have to be realistic. The grocery store example hits very close to home, because we've been trying for 2 decades to get grocery stores in our neighborhoods that are known food deserts. And despite the fact that we've come up with, in some cases, very creative tax credits, and in other cases, we've given the land, we still can't entice grocers to come in there. That's not the developer's fault. That's the retailers who are looking at some map and saying, I'm not going to generate, because they're operating on 1% to 2% margins, I'm not going to generate enough income from that particular demographic, wherever it is. So I think we also have to be realistic. And when somebody says, I want a grocery store, I think it's the responsible thing to say, I don't think that's likely. But we may be able to come up with some other way to do it. Maybe it's, urban agriculture and local sourcing, or if you can incentivize a retailer to come in, you've got to make sure they stay, because there's nothing more depressing than bringing a grocery store in and watching it close within 6 months or a year. So I agree with everything you said. I just think we have to be realistic when people are making a request for a certain item, that we need to be clear up front that the opportunity to have that might be low, but if we do these things, we need to make sure it stays here.
I think that it's just important. I really don't want the rest of the panel to really hit it. The honesty thing is so important, and there has to be give and take. A developer can't show up into a neighborhood and work collaboratively and listen and have everything taken away from them. There's got to be a happy medium where the developer, there's going to, like in some of the stuff that we're doing in Remington, in order to support the local businesses that are starting, we've got to bring in some larger businesses that are going to be more of a draw from the outside. And the neighborhood has been acceptive of that. Because it's going to let other smaller shops who otherwise wouldn't have gotten the foot traffic to stay open and succeed. So as long as there's healthy conversation and honesty, and everybody understands that give and take is important, I think it can be a successful process.
David?
Oh, I think I've spoke my piece. Yeah.
Andre?
One of the proudest days of my life was when I was working for a community development corporation in the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, and we utterly transformed in one day 6 alleyways that, with hundreds of volunteers, most of whom were local residents, and by the end of the day, you have the nonprofit folks, you got the residents, you have even the DPW guys who are just supposed to cart the stuff away. We're getting all excited. They're like, "Oh, I'll go get the backhoe," and the New Balance and Timberland sent employees. So it was a great public, private, nonprofit, resident partnership. But weeds grow back, and it's unrealistic to think that you're going to have hundreds of volunteers come out 3-4 times a year to fix that up. And so I think one of the mistakes that we make is thinking that somebody else will take care of it, or that volunteers can do it. We have to resource our neighborhoods and our community groups and our organizing. People really undervalue community organizing. But the fact is, there would be more certainty, I think, in development processes if the developers were investing in the community folks that they could actually have a conversation with. Oftentimes, there's no capacity to even have that kind of a conversation. They need to be backed up with some experts, technical experts, and resources and staffing and funding. Nobody can do this for free forever.
That's right.
My last comment is that for years I got used to working in a poor city So every time you said anything in Oakland, I don't know how it's like in other cities that people work in, but Bill, you're nodding your head. But everything was like, we don't have money. So last year, we got to write this report because we got some funding from MTC, from our Regional Sustainable Prosperity Grant. And one thing that we were able to do is pay a really, really smart and very nice young man to go through all the City Council and Planning Commission agendas and reports for the last 20 years. And what he found out that we put in the report was that even in some of the darkest days in our city, revenue and financially, our city was still spending money. Millions of dollars, right? Some projects got upwards of $20 million of public investment, including a downtown housing development project by our ex-Mayor Brown that got almost $27 million for a single project. So I think what I'm trying to say is that if there's one thing that I would really make a pitch for is how can we utilize public processes, public policy, and public revenues much smarter? Because when I think of the problem of the grocery store, I'm like, that's when I would like my city to step in, right? I think 20 million or 27 million in investment is a good use for a neighborhood that's been waiting 50 over years for a grocery store. I think that's a good thing. And I get these are not simple problems with simple answers. I think, I really appreciate that. But I think that this is where we need to think about, the kind of public responsibility of our public agencies, our municipal governments, and our public financing. So,
ladies and gentlemen, a hand for the audience, for the panel. We did open this up as sort of an overture to all of the conversations that you'll be having during the course of the next couple of days. So hopefully you got a taste of sort of the range of issues and items that will be discussed over the course of the conference, and also the tone by which we think these conversations should take place. There should be some discussion, some debate, and some complexity, as I think, in trying to get to these solutions. And if we walk away without doing that, we probably have failed in trying to move something forward. So thanks very much, and I hope you have a great time. Thank you.